In the spring of 1924, Rudolph Valentino and his wife Natasha Rambova honeymooned in Europe, where they were wined and dined and welcomed as royalty in London and in Paris. Rudy and Natasha were pursued by adoring fans who trolled their itinerary to ensure prime vantage points outside all venues where the couple appeared, whether a train station, a hotel, or the site of another glittering celebrity reception in their honor. Their fans shared their coveted stakeouts with a press corps jostling for position for anything, any angle, which could reward them with a headline and a byline. And so Rudy and Natasha went to Paris that spring, again the focus of all attention, especially garnering the attention of one Countess Marguerite de Chenier. She was a member of a French aristocratic family of great note and known for her acid sense of humor, or referred to then as her, quote, tartness of speech. The Countess's tart speech and questionably cruel sense of humor would soon target the Valentinos, and this is how the story goes. I quote, "Finally, the Valentinos were bidden to be guests of honor at the biggest and most brilliant reception that yet had marked their stay abroad. All of social Paris was there, mingling with distinguished guests from abroad. Medals glittered, decorations were like bits of color in a kaleidoscope. It was a gathering of beauty, wit, and wealth. And it was here, so say the Paris gossips, that the Countess de Chenier approached Rudolph with her charming smile. 'Oh, Mr. Valentino,' she said, 'have you seen your portrait at the Salon? It is a very wonderful painting, and a marvelous likeness.' The man who had seen his picture so many times, in so many places, undoubtedly experienced a brand new thrill, a painting of himself, and in the Salon. Of course he was overwhelmed with the honor of having been chosen for the subject of such a work of art. 'Why, no, I didn't know anything about it,' he replied, 'but I certainly shall look it up tomorrow. Who did it?' 'It's by Albert Guillaume, and it's called The Matinee Idol.' If a moment of silence descended upon the group, Valentino failed to mark it, and early the next day, in company with his charming wife, he motored to the Salon, where a crowd had gathered in anticipation of his arrival. The attendant saluted when they asked to be conducted to the Albert Guillaume painting. Pompously the attendant led the way. Finally they stood before the canvas, which the Countess de Chenier had declared was a faithful likeness of the film actor. And what they saw was the depiction of a group of women all fawning upon an actor in an undershirt, seated before a dressing table. The actor was accepting the feminine adoration in a lordly manner with an egotistical and somewhat middle-aged face held high. But the astonishing feature of the painting was the entirely bald head of the figure, while upon a rack at his side hung a wig. Now, if Mr. Valentino and his wife had just happened into the Salon and had seen the picture casually, they probably would have given it merely a smile and a passing thought. It is certain that they never would have considered Rudolph the inspiration for the figure, since there was no marked resemblance. But he had been told that the picture was of himself. He went to the Salon with that idea firmly fixed in his mind. So those around saw the customary chic smile fade slowly. They saw an angry sparkle in Mrs. Valentino's eyes. They saw the two turn about and walk away without a glance to right or left, and it was quite plain that Mrs. Valentino's chin was higher, her cheeks redder, and her eyes angrier than were her husband's. Why was the handsome Valentino so sensitive, everyone asked. The great screen lover is not bald, no indeed. As a matter of fact, he has quite a few hairs, so many that he doesn't need to let the ends grow long to conceal bare spots, a device employed by certain other matinee idols. He certainly doesn't appear to be in need of hair tonics, electric massage, or the X-ray cure for scanty locks. Why, it's a base libel to even suggest that the adored Rudolph is bald. All of which is quite true. The famous Valentino hair is quite soft and shining and prolific, but like most men, he probably is haunted by a horrible specter. It is the fear of becoming bald at 40. End quote. This story is cited to the Buffalo Times-Sun, Sunday, April 6, 1924, and an article titled, quote, "Why That Salon Painting Peeved Mrs. Rudolph Valentino," with a subtitle, "Paris Didn't Blame Her for Getting Huffy, for whoever said that Rudy lacked hair, or ever heard of a bald-headed chic?" We've used this painting, The Matinee Idol by Albert Guillaume, as the image for this podcast episode. This article reveals a glimpse back in time, where we witness Rudolph Valentino being wounded by an act of cruel bullying and suffering from an attempt to mock him for any potential baldness, and for the Countess Margarita, an effort to take him down a notch. And yes, reporter Winifred Van Duzep got her byline and her full-page illustrated story and milked this setting up of Rudolph Valentino for all it was worth. Today I will expand on our previous episode and use this single moment for Valentino in that Paris salon in 1924 as a point of reference for an analysis of bullying behavior as it targeted him then and as it continues today in this episode, which we have titled Rudolph Valentino, His Bullies, and More.
Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the proud publisher of all the scholarly, entertaining, and documented books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya. I'm here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. In our previous 2 episodes, we discussed our new book, just published by you, Renato, a book which you translated from Spanish to English. Yes, you did. Thank you. The book is titled The True Rudolph Valentino and was written by Baltasar Fernandez Coué in 1927. This was a book Valentino was collaborating on in the weeks just prior to his final trip to New York City in 1926. According to Coué, Valentino was so troubled by his misrepresentation and the open attacks against him by the press that he wanted to set his record straight by writing his true autobiography. Baltasar Coué finished the book after Valentino died, and The True Rudolph Valentino was published in 1927-1928 as a 10-installment series in the Spanish-language movie magazine Cine Mundial. Your translation, Renato, has made this fascinating work available for the first time to an English-speaking audience. As we mentioned in our previous episode, Valentino's spokeswoman Janine Villalobos cited the Baltasar Coué manuscript as one she referenced heavily in her dissertation. She spoke highly of the Coué work, stating her great-grandfather Alberto Valentino believed it to be his brother's truest story. So our discussion today of bullying and Rudolph Valentino is inspired by Coué's book, as that was the original reason the book came into being. We have previously mentioned how Coué reports seeing Valentino open a drawer in his desk to then pull out several articles and documents he felt Coué might find useful in writing this book. These articles were primarily indicative of a hostile press and seemed to have been clipped and kept in the drawer because they were deeply upsetting to Valentino. Now, this was before the infamous Pink Powder Puff editorial, which was published in the Chicago Tribune in 1926, accusing him of being an effeminate influence on men. And in mentioning this chronological note, I address the following, because this episode is presented as an answer to a question posed by Valentino collector Tracy Terhune, a question which he posted on that hate blog he has run for 7 years and counting under my book's title, which he has wielded as his bully pulpit to divert my web traffic in an open effort to ruin us in our work and to make us suffer. So Terhune asks the question, and I quote, "On May 13th, 2019, Tracy Terhune posts the following, and I quote, Zumaya lays laurels at the feet of Baltasar Coué, saying he was living at Falcon Lair, working feverishly in the office, while Rudy was traveling, promoting Son of the Sheik. His work with Rudy was to counter all the lies about Valentino, says Zumaya. What lies? Outside the Pink Powder Puff article, which was at this point unwritten yet, what lies would Valentino be trying to dispel? None. She just made that up to fit the narrative that Valentino and Coué were collaborating. End quote.
I have to say I was very surprised to read that, and I know you were too.
I was actually shocked to read that, Renato, because Tracy Terhune, who obviously positions himself as some sort of infallible leader of the Valentino world, he asks what lies could Rudolph Valentino have possibly wanted to dispel about himself before the Pink Powder Puff editorial in 1926. According to him, there were, and I quote, none. This despite Janine Villalobos referring to the inspiration for Valentino's collaboration with Coué as his feeling embattled by the press. In actuality, Valentino was under attack on many fronts throughout his entire film career, and even before. In today's discussion, I will touch upon some of those fronts, because it is a very important topic in regards to Valentino today, and in an effort to enlighten Tracy Terhune on the subject of the bullying of Valentino, pre-Pink Powder Puff editorial. Because historically, the bashing of Valentino began very early on in his life in America. Very early on.
In Coué's book, he writes about one incident which reveals he's being targeted during his first days in Hollywood.
I think some of the abusive rhetoric targeting Valentino sure began then, and we see some of the first injurious comments he had to contend with being bandied about. This is an element Baltasar Coué focuses on in this book because, as I said, this was the reason Valentino began his collaboration. And I read from The True Rudolph Valentino, page 62. And I quote, "The following Saturday, Pauline Frederick hosted another big party at her home in Beverly Hills, and of course she invited Douglas. He asked her by phone if he could bring Rudolph. Oh, of course. My mother and aunt are very pleased with him. He is a nice boy and an admirable dancer." Two things occurred at that party which left Rudolph deeply affected. The actor Thomas Mahan called him aside and spoke with him in a low voice and for a long time. When Rudolph returned to Douglas, he had tears in his eyes. Mahan told him he was well aware of Rudolph the dancer's bad reputation, and went on to say even more humiliating things to Rudolph. How could anyone imagine that in the future, when innumerable friends would turn their backs on Rudolph in one of the most critical moments of his life, it would be the benevolent Thomas Mahan who would be the first to reach out to help, and with the most timely effectiveness." End quote. And on page 53, I quote, "Perhaps Rudolph was not so loved in Hollywood, and on many occasions he said he thought he knew the reason why. Across America, he was referred to as a pimp, a name first whispered about him in the artistic centers of New York." End quote. So there's further evidence of this same issue confronting Valentino, which is an incident involving Alla Nazimova, also a witnessed event, and I read a short excerpt from Affairs Valentino, page 71. And I quote, "It was common knowledge in the Hollywood community that Alla Nazimova once publicly accused Rudolph Valentino of being a home-wrecking Lothario. Nazimova lived in New York City during the DeSalles divorce hearing, as well as Jack DeSalles' murder trial. During a dinner party at the Ship's Cafe in Santa Monica, she chided Rudy about his role in the DeSalles scandals. In the presence of several Metro executives and actress Dagmar Godowski, Nazimova referred to Rudy as a pimp and put the blame for Jack DeSalles' murder squarely upon his illicit affair with Mrs. DeSalles." End quote. Now, the definition of a pimp as someone who connects clients with prostitutes and profits from that arrangement has plagued Valentino's legacy whenever there's a discussion of that time of his life. I never found a hint of evidence that this was the case, and feel that the only reason it still lingers about, or even has a presence, is because it is wielded as titillating material by Valentino porn fiction writer David Brett to toss into his salaciously concocted books. There is also another claim made that Valentino worked as a gigolo during the same time frame, a gigolo being a fancy word for male prostitute. Again, with no evidence that this was ever true, quite the contrary. In my opinion, this is a David Brett contribution to Valentino's story, and one he perpetuates with no proof other than supporting it with zero documentation. The evidence that does exist about Valentino's problematic life in New York City, which was the source of these negative remarks, refers to his involvement with the married socialite Blanca de Sales. Now, I'm not going to relate this story here today because I devoted a chapter to it in Affairs Valentino. But the reason this scandal haunted Valentino's initial days in Hollywood was not a totally false report. He had an affair with a married woman. Although she was separated from her husband, Jack, this would not be the extent of that scandal. Valentino was arrested in the aftermath of his courtroom testimony on his lover Blanca's behalf in her divorce trial. Her ex-husband Jack would provide one of the first accounts of Valentino being called a pimp, and I cite this from Coué's The True Rudolph Valentino, page 44. And I quote, Jack de Sales, grew jealous of Rudolfo, and his anger was about to explode. One night, as Jack was having dinner with friends at the Café des Artistes, Rudolfo arrived to join the group, as he had on so many previous times. It did not take long for Jack to provoke a dispute with the dancer by asking him who he thought he was to go around dancing with his wife, to which Rudolfo replied, I respect her as a lady. Jack said, well then, we do not want any pimp here, he added, and he then threw the contents of a glass of liquor at Rudolfo. Rudolfo did not make the slightest movement to react and told him, Jack, your wife has insistently asked me to testify against you in the divorce trial, and I have not accepted until now because I believed you were my friend. Tomorrow I will go and tell her that I'm willing to declare how much I know about you. End quote. Now, Blanca would murder her ex-husband shortly after Valentino left New York, and he would narrowly escape being summoned to testify in her murder trial. An involvement with a married person may not seem like such a scandalous thing to do now, but having an affair with a married person carried a great stigma at the time, and one which would soon be connected specifically to Rudolph Valentino himself. But more about that in a bit here. At the time, Valentino had no real ability to control his negative press, such as suppressing news about his involvement with the de Sales murder. There was no damage controlling. That would not begin until George Ullman arrived on the scene. Although, as I mentioned in our episode Rudy, Coué, and More, I think Valentino's friend Doug Gerard did act as a manager some in those early days. But Ullman would arrive to do something about the innuendos by suppressing those early discretions by Rudolph Valentino. Now, George Ullman writes in his 1975 memoir how one of the first things he did as Valentino's manager was to fire his lawyer, Arthur Butler Graham, and demand he surrender a file of papers which Graham was holding as a secret file on Valentino, which, if revealed, would ruin his career. And I read from Affairs Valentino, page 186. And I quote, retaining attorney Max Steuer was one of the first orders of business George transacted on Rudy's behalf. Steuer was a highly respected New York City attorney and once practiced law with the firm of Prince and Nathan, where he represented Blanca de Sales when she sued her husband for divorce. George retained Max Steuer within hours of firing Rudy's attorney Arthur Graham. He was adamant Graham had bilked Rudy out of tens of thousands of dollars while doing nothing to negotiate the stalemate with famous player Lasky. Arthur Graham did not go quietly, and upon learning of his termination, he instigated an angry exchange with his replacement Max Steuer. This occurred after Steuer requested Graham surrender Rudy's entire case file. Graham responded by submitting a bill to Steuer for an additional $27,000 for services rendered. He attached an ominous note to his hefty invoice, which stated that if payment was not received in full, he would not only retain possession of Rudy's case file, but release every snippet of confidential material in said file to the press. Max Steuer fired back by dispatching a courier to hand-deliver a copy of the law's penalty for blackmail to Graham's office. Steuer also attached a personal note to his correspondence, warning Graham that he would not hesitate to report his threat to the district attorney's office. After several more heated exchanges, it was Graham who finally conceded when he agreed to exchange his top-secret Valentino file for a settlement of $10,000. When George and Max Steyer sat down to pore over Graham's Valentino file, they found it contained nothing more than newspaper clippings, a few court documents, and police records of Rudy's run-ins with the law during his earliest days in New York." End quote. So, yes, from a professional standpoint, I guess there were things to cover up for the sake of Valentino's public image, those unfortunate vestiges of his earliest days in New York. But the allegation and claims he was living as a pimp and a gigolo represent some of the earliest instances of bullying by name-calling and shaming him.
Obviously, Valentino was successful in moving past those very unfortunate monikers.
He was, but his history reveals he always had enemies, those out to pollute and impugn his reputation with lies, those bullies taking advantage to bring him down a notch with demeaning and even hateful rhetoric. And in this regard, he would really hand them fodder when he found fame in his signature movie, The Sheik, in 1921, becoming a proverbial household name. Those lies and attacks, the unabashed bullying of Rudolph Valentino as the Sheik, really became almost a national pastime for his detractors.
Are you claiming Valentino was bullied because of his movie, The Sheik?
Oh, I am, Renato. Yes, I am. For me, this is one of the most interesting aspects of The Sheik, how quickly the word was absorbed in the vernacular of the day. It became not only a noun, but a verb and an adjective. It was a sociological phenomenon. As much as Valentino's character of the Sheik was emulated and adored, his chic success handed his detractors, a polite word for bullies, it provided them with fodder for abuse. In this respect, he became the object of endless lampooning, as he was basically identified as the Sheik. Now, the word Sheik came to define all things offensive, someone making unwanted amorous and physical advances, a scoundrel, a cad, a masher, a playboy, someone who engaged in a range of most often petty criminal activity. And George Ullman mentioned the subject in an article he wrote, which was published in the Los Angeles Herald Express in July of 1944, an article titled, "Dead Valentino Still Hero," to his agent. And I quote, "Every famous person is more or less the victim of his legend. None more so than the boy born Rudolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pier Filibert Guglielmi de Valentina d'Antangula, who came to be called the Sheik. Rudy hated that tag, especially after it became a byword for what is known as wolfing today. He was never a Sheik in the accepted sense of the word. He was a man who sought to love one woman and whose unsatisfied dream was for a real home and children." End quote. Some of the heaviest rhetoric levied against Valentino, this bullying in regards to the Sheik, which I found while researching Affairs Valentino, was published when Valentino and Natasha Rambova toured the U.S., performing as dancers and spokespeople for Mineral Lava Beauty Clay. This was very much the case during their visit to Portland, Oregon. And I read an excerpt about this from Affairs Valentino, page 176, and I quote, "On the day the Mineral Lava train pulled into Portland, Oregon, local newspapers reported a citywide police sweep of any youth sporting the style of dress stereotypically considered to be under Sheik influence, slick-backed, Vaselined hair, and any fashion deemed flashy. Headlines in the Morning Oregonian told the story. Sheiks have convention in municipal jail cells, with the crimes of Rudy imitators listed as general hoodlummery. The detainees in the municipal jail were referred to as sheiks and sheikdesses, and one apparently less natty fellow received the dubious honor of being dubbed a sub-sheik. Nevertheless, Rudy's appearances in city after city continued to inspire highly charged opinions about his popularity. For as deftly as he had seduced millions of hormonally driven teenagers and bored housewives, he had also inspired the mobilization of anti-Sheik activists intent upon quashing his allegedly nefarious influence. One particular individual intent upon doing some serious quashing was the Oregonian's reporter on the beat the day the Mineral Lava tour arrived in Portland. Prim correspondent Leon Baer was one of the few women who loathed Rudolph Valentino and believed Mr. and Mrs. Valentino were not Hollywood immortals, but Hollywood immorals. Apparently someone tipped Rudy off to Miss Bare's low opinion of him, for at the last minute he refused to grant her scheduled interview. His snub did not bode well with Leon Bare, and this was reflected in her article in the Oregonian the following day. She mocked his Italian accent, quote, "There is gonna to be a great war soon, a war against the motion picture trusts, in which brains and art will be shed instead of bloodshed." Furthermore, she accused Rudy of effeminacy by wondering if he canceled their interview because his face was caked with the beauty clay. She titled her invective, "Cold Cream Chic Hides from Collar," with a subtitle, "Valentino, Model for Effeminate Lads, is Here," end quote. And I point out again for Tracy Terhune's benefit that this was 1923, 3 years before the Pink Powder Puff editorial. Now, another evolution of the chic stigma affecting Valentino was the use of the term chiking itself. Chiking was initially a more general term covering a range of unsavory behavior and even dress, but it rather quickly came to be known specifically as the act of someone breaking up a marriage. Now, in Nebraska, a bill was introduced to make chiking a crime, punishable by prison terms. In an article titled "Prison Terms for All Vamps and Chics," I read this brief piece here. It says, "A bill introduced in Nebraska legislature some time ago is causing a tremendous to-do in this Commonwealth and elsewhere all of a sudden because somebody has discovered it is reasonably certain sooner or later to become a law. State Senator John W. Cooper, the author of it, calls it his anti-chiking bill, although the calendar name is the Alienation of Affections bill. Unless the act of Mr. Cooper is headed off, chiking and vamping will become felonies in the state of Nebraska, punishable by fines of from $1,000 to $2,500 and prison terms ranging from 1 to 5 years. By chic, the senator means any man who tampers with the affections of a married woman and lures her away from her more or less trusting spouse." End quote. So was this a direct result of the shaming of Rudolph Valentino in regards to his affair with Mrs. Jack DeSalles? I think it was. Valentino was not only the chic, the very person his enemies perceived as being responsible for the scandalous phenomena, but he was reported to have been guilty of chiking himself. He did not hesitate to refute this, and on many occasions he responded angrily to the chiking stigma and its abuse. And I cite one article here titled, "Valentino Loathes Both Name and Film of Chic, He Asserts." And this is from the Courier-Journal, dated April 2nd, 1923. And I quote, "I do not want to be known as a matinee idol," the black-haired son of Italy declared, "for I consider it only a courteous way of referring to one as a dumbbell, accent on the last syllable. The flutterer of 1,000,000 hearts and more sat in a soft chair in his private car in the Louisville and Nashville yards at 10th Street and Broadway. He was clad in a heavy tweed sports suit and wore a wristwatch. Mrs. Valentino was in another part of the car, changing the attire which she wore while motoring about the city, through the parks and to Churchill Downs with Rudolph to see the thoroughbreds. The Four Horsemen and Blood and Sand, I think they are my best pictures," Valentino went on, taking a Turkish cigarette from his case. "As far as the chic and some of the other travesties are concerned, I'm ashamed of them." End quote. And you know, Renato, I found another unbelievable little article dated May 28th, 1923, titled, "Thought Chiking Too Successful, Students Use Tar." So, yes, someone was actually tarred and feathered because it was reported they were chiking with too many girls, and consequently they suffered this awful fate. That's just incredible to think about. I think at this point in Valentino's life, despite having support in the press, and obviously because his employers wielded all power in generating positive press for him, one does not have to look too long to find many mentions of those biased and cruel bullying attacks levied against him. And yes, these were things I am sure he considered lies about himself, which he was anxious to dispel. By 1923 to 24, hostile rhetoric targeting Valentino was rampant in the press, and this was not specific to the U.S. press, as you found some very aggressively anti-Valentino pieces in French archives. And in reference to the incident in the Paris art salon, Valentino was continually dogged by the innuendo claiming he was going bald. Now, this had to have contributed to his hair loss, and by the end of his life, he did wear a toupee. In one article, some crude cut-and-paste work actually portrays him as bald, kissing his co-star Nita Naldi, with a headline reading, "Bald-Headed Movie Peril." And in March of 1923, we find Valentino spitting mad in response to yet another lie in the press, and I cite the Dayton Herald, March 31st, 1923, and I quote, "Mr. and Mrs. Valentino, who are in New Orleans this week, became very much aroused over a telegram received Thursday, informing them that an Assistant Attorney General of Indiana had expressed the belief that the marriage license obtained in Lake County by Valentino and Winifred Hudnut was illegal." Valentino is quoted as saying, "We received the news en route to New Orleans. At first I thought it was so idiotic a statement that I was going to ignore it. But I have been getting angrier and angrier as I have thought about it. They'd better watch out. They're getting near the danger point in this persecution of my wife and me." End quote. Logically, these attacks on Valentino prompted his employers to work overtime, portraying their star as anything but those negative stereotypes. Valentino's fictional portrayals, which according to Balthasar Coué, Valentino himself found offensive and lamentable, were born. And I cite the True Rudolph Valentino, page 24. And I quote, "What Rudolph did was to tell an advertising agent some of the great guidelines of his life, as his memory recalled them, as his criteria and taste formulated them, and as his professional conveniences allowed. And since he was very human, in doing so, vanity did not stop him from introducing his quota of fables. The advertising agent, in turn, took this data, and through his own ingenuity and fantasy wrote what seemed appropriate. And since, far from hurting Rudolph, this presented him in a flattering way, the actor, instead of amending the mistakes, was happy and grateful. Only in this way can it be explained that the autobiography of Rudolph Valentino, called My Life Story, relates events which the actor knew very well never happened." End quote. Now, at the time Coué began collaborating with Valentino, Valentino was still reeling over another fresh source of condemnation. After he filed for U.S. citizenship in 1925, the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini banned all things Rudolph Valentino and held him up as an example to other Italians who might consider expatriating. There are many accounts of people seeing such things as framed photographs of Valentino in Italian movie theater lobbies being removed. And Renato, you've researched this a great deal, the anti-Valentino campaign in Mussolini's Italy, the fall of 1925. And on many occasions, things turned violent.
Yes, it did. Sometimes people in the audience even shot at the movie screen, and sometimes there were riots outside the theater, crowds chanting and touting moviegoers who were just out to watch Rudolph Valentino in maybe The Sheik or another film.
We recorded an episode titled Rudy, Mussolini, and More, so please listen to that for more on this subject. But the Italian fascist furor over Valentino's filing for U.S. citizenship instigated a dangerous situation for him when he traveled to Europe in December of 1925 to promote his movie The Eagle. Mussolini absolutely whipped Italian audiences into an anti-Valentino frenzy, a hissing frenzy. Hissing seems to have been the preferred protest at the time in Italian theaters. This is something I found interesting, and it must have been a thing to do with that era, because I have never known Italians to hiss. And I cite this small article from the Akron Beacon Journal dated December 17th, 1925, titled When a Star Travels, and I quote, "In Paris, the gendarmes had to be called out to rescue Rudolph Valentino from a crowd of feminine admirers. In Italy, Signor Mussolini had to send a company of militia to defend him from being mobbed by his countrymen, who were displeased because he had announced his intention to give up Italian for American citizenship. It is told that a movement to hiss Valentino off the screen in 2 Roman movie theaters was forestalled by fascists with bayonets. America should start a movement to keep its film stars and their press agents at home. It is already sufficiently accused of breaking the heart of the world without having Hollywood add to the complications." End quote. So in addition to the bullying of Valentino by being called a pimp and a gigolo, a chic guilty of chiking, long before the pink powder puff editorial, Valentino was also a dictator's target and had an entire country calling him renegade, traitor, and an offense to all Italians. So Tracy Terhune asking, what could Valentino have possibly needed to correct about his story before the pink powder puff editorial? So very much. And this is but an overview, an outline. And as our knowledgeable listeners know, the abuse of Valentino is a story that goes much deeper than I have barely covered here today. It is my opinion that Rudolph Valentino was bullied, body-shamed, mocked, lied about, and exploited by nefarious elements to such a high degree in the pre-Pink Powder Puff editorial time frame that the impact of that editorial when it was published hit Valentino almost as a lethal assault. It is not surprising to me he died young with the stress of coping with that. Now, incredibly, this abuse of Rudolph Valentino by lies, name-calling, and bullying is still very much a part of his legacy today. It really, really is.
Well, in closing today, we will thank everyone who sent us kind words of support and who are actively helping us with this great work. And please, find all our books on Amazon, and I really hope you enjoy them all.
And I want to read in closing this last little piece of the article on the Albert Guillaume painting, The Matinee Idol, because we cannot leave this discussion with him in any way guilty of the ruse played out against Rudolph Valentino by that bullying Countess Margherita and her tart speech. And I quote, "And is it surprising that Mrs. Valentino, who knows each of her lord's heart's secrets, including the terror of baldness, should have been downright angry when she saw the Guillaume painting? However, they apparently decided to do nothing about the matter. No suit for damages was threatened. There were no rumors of a duel to be fought. Everybody said that the film actor meant to stand on his dignity and forget that painting. Nevertheless, it was judged that if ever he were to meet the artist, at least a spatty time was in progress. Finally, when the gossip got round to friends of Guillaume, someone sent him a warning. Valentino surely will make trouble. If he catches you, some such hint was offered. Valentino, he replied. What Valentino? Why, Rudolph Valentino, the great moving picture star from America. Why should he make trouble for me? Why shouldn't he? Didn't you use him as the inspiration for your salon painting, The Matinee Idol? I did not, Guillaume answered with emphasis. I never heard of him before. And that was the end of the incident, for the artist's denial was promptly carried back to the Valentinos, and the truth of the story accomplished several things. It assuaged Rudolph's irritation, it appeased his wife's anger, and it released a chuckle, many chuckles, in fact, for the Countess de Chenier of the tart tongue." End quote. And I add my thank you, as always, to those kind and intelligent supporters who take the time to contact us and share materials which we use in these podcasts.
So, and for today, as the usual, I say Fiat Justitia, Ruat Caelum. And for the nice guys, arrivederci.